I've been holding on to this story for a number of years, since every so often there's a good time to tell it, and I felt that I should finally post it here to get people's thoughts on it. I'd like to apologize in advance, as I'd like to think I'm a decent storyteller in person, but pretty lackluster/long-winded with text. Also, as I write about later, I try and use animal noises to describe some sounds. Take them all with a grain of salt, as even I know that's not the exact thing I heard, but the closest sound I can relate it to or describe it with. I go between, a couple of times, as I describe at the end. My friends and I all discussed what happened to confirm we all in fact heard the same thing and had the same experience. To preface the story and where it takes place, I grew up in the Huron region of Ontario. For those not familiar, it's about a 3-hour drive directly west from Toronto, where I now live, on the shore of Lake Huron. During my time in high school, there was one teacher who had talked about his experiences in a small forested place called Lob's Bush. Although I wasn't very familiar with it at the time, it was known by a fair number of locals as a very haunted place in the area, or where people have had unexplainable but startlingly similar encounters. This teacher was very outspoken about his experiences in that bush, but also his steadfast trust in being a non-believer in the paranormal/supernatural, which in turn made him, of all people, the most fascinating to hear it from. Always ends his stories or answers questions with, "I don't believe it, can't explain it, I'm just telling you what happened." A few years later, in the winter of 2017, both after having him as my teacher in high school and having since moved away to attend my first year of university, I came back to my hometown for my winter break to spend some time with family and catch up with my friend group. For anyone familiar with the small-town experience, our favorite activity was the age-old classic of buying a terrible number of cheap reservation cigarettes, hopping in one of our friends' terribly run-down beater cars, and then smoking, chatting, and playing the worst music ever conceived until either the smokes or the gas tank runs out. We were all hovering around 60, 80, so this was just the most fun, degenerate things we could do. On top of finally having a break from all my uni coursework, this was the first time seeing these friends in a couple of months, so we were all excited to be one big group again. I won't bore you with all the earlier antics of the evening, but where this story picks up is after driving around, catching up for a few hours, we pit stop at a random bush trail so some of us could smoke some weed. As we started walking down one of the trails, I remember feeling a very stark change in the atmosphere around us. I didn't really want to express my feelings to ruin the mood, but I definitely felt the need to be on high alert. I've never really had a way to describe the physical feeling apart from my chest feeling heavy, but somehow it was very clear that something was watching us and did not want us there. Every few steps I needed to look back to make sure something wasn't stalking us. All we had were our phone flashlights, which had a very short distance. The way the trail sat in the bush, it was all new trees, so they curled over the path to almost form a tunnel. It looked as if we had walked into the maw of a massive creature, slowly making our way down its throat. We only made it about a few hundred meters before realizing that the calm night was turning into a winter storm. We all agreed to go back to the car and would start making our way home before it got any worse. By the time we made it back to the car, the trees were swinging wildly in the wind, and the snow made it hard to see the next couple of feet in front of us. Once we made it to the car, we started to drive back to the closest town so as to stay at a friend's place to wait out the storm. While driving, the weather continued getting worse until the snow had practically blinded us while going around a notable halfway there turn. We found out that our estimate of how far to turn the car wasn't enough and felt the car's momentum stall and slide sideways into the ditch. After a short period of us hurling claims of backseat driving and general frustrations, we ended up staying in the ditch for around 5 hours before being rescued by local police and driven the rest of the way into town. During our time in the ditch, I talked about how I felt while walking in the woods. We all agreed with the feeling of knowing we shouldn't be there, and none of us spoke up until now. Only after that did our friend in the driver's seat, and the only one familiar with these particular back roads, inform us that we were in fact walking through Lob's Bush. Fast forward some time to, I believe, my second semester reading week. I'm back home with my friends and back to our same old acts. After a particularly good night of catching up, we decided to go revisit Lob's Bush, as none of us had been there since getting caught in the ditch, and the weather was already warm this month with far less snow. I remember feeling almost excited to go back, rather than dark, impenetrable clouds and snow. Tonight the moon was out and barely needed flashlights to see where we were going. We parked the car in the same spot and grabbed all necessary smoking apparatus and a pack of smokes for the driver and me to share, as, of course, neither time are we dumb enough to get our designated driver high. As we started walking into the trail, I started realizing landmarks that I had missed from my first time there. With the moonlight making everything more visible, I walked through the same threshold as before and was pleasantly surprised that I didn't feel like I was watched or unwelcome to walk through. After a point, I had almost forgotten that I was in the infamous woods and was enjoying a late-night walk through the forest, laughing with my friends. After walking further down the trail, we finally came to an opening. On the right side of the trail, the trees had parted out to showcase the edge of a field, nicely lit by the moonlight. On the left side, the bush clears out so there is a lovely section of grass and light foliage parting to show a small stream cutting through. It looked like a naturally made auditorium with the stream cutting through like a main walkway, sparse trees, so plenty of seating for an audience, and the trees opening and leading down to the farmer's field as the stage. In all honesty, I had completely forgotten we were there to smoke and was just enamored with how pretty it was. As we found a spot to stop and ready our lights to smoke, one friend had the bright idea to exclaim, "Yo, I forgot I've got a Roman candle." As we all turned to look, they had already gotten their lighter out and was proceeding to light the candle. Again, we were late teens, we were idiots. She proceeds to point the candle towards the big clearing to the field, every once in a while moving it around so it is not all shooting in the same spot. Going higher and higher into the air, she finally points it in the opposite direction towards the wood. With surprising accuracy, none of the shots actually hit anything before going out until one finally hits a tree near the stream and spirals into the woods, where we can't see it. Within no more than a second's time, this blood-curdling scream comes from the exact place the Roman candle bounced into the woods beyond our view. We all completely froze, unsure of what to make of it, as the scream continued on for a worrisome amount of time. I can only describe it as a cross between a deeper version of a howler monkey's roar and an ear-ringing whine like an elk's bugle, going higher in pitch as it kept screaming. I remember my ears vibrating from how loud it was. I wanted to cover them, but we were all frozen in place from it. Finally, one of us snapped into reality and yelled, "Run!" and bolted off towards the farmer's field. We all in turn started running away from the ongoing scream from within the woods. As we were running, the scream finally stopped. After about 10 seconds of constant noise, there was no breath or change in the scream apart from pitch. It was able to yell at that volume for longer than I've heard any animal do. Before we could even think, we heard a heavy rustling in the woods, as Whatever it was took a deep inhale to scream again. The inhale was just as terrifying, sounding like an alligator's bellow mixed with a hyena's laugh. I know both sounds I'm describing are from exhaling, but you could tell this was a guttural, full-chested and preparatory inhale before screaming again. Unlike the first scream, that almost hitting it, I didn't see the reaction time at all. We could only hear the crying. It was dripping with fear. Surprised by the reaction from the screaming spat. I know this sound is hard to believe, but the next following scream was unmistakable. This was clearly an angry roar. Whatever it was really fucking big, with an enormous centiverse side along its length, and at least 10 feet in length, now moving towards us. It was even louder, and what I could only assume was now pointed towards us. Even though we were all heavy smokers at the time, we all ran as fast as we possibly could without looking back, absolutely terrified from the second continuous roar that was now gaining on us. After about 15 seconds, the scream stopped abruptly. It took us a second to realize the noise was gone. We turned around to see that we'd made it out of the woods and onto the field. We only looked back briefly to see we had put about 5,0,1,0,0 meters between us and the edge of the bush. Even before we could really think straight, we shakily agreed to make our way to the closest road to make our way back to the front of the bush to find where we parked. It was only once we got to the road and caught our smoked-out breath did one of us finally ask if we all heard and felt that. We all talked briefly, but were too on edge to actually converse. About 20 minutes later, we finally made it back to the road and had the car in sight. We all started to calm down as we had some time to process and let the adrenaline wear off. We unlocked the car, all got into our respective seats with our bags. None of us had the time to take it off before the first scream happened. As the driver finally turned the car on and the headlights flooded the woods in front of us, the front passenger just screamed, "Drive! Drive!" The driver, without looking, cranked the car into reverse and turned around to back out quickly and go down the back road as fast as he could beside the bush. The friend who screamed started to freak out all over again. I was sitting directly behind him with my hand on his shoulder from the back seat. As we tried to ask what was wrong, I was looking over my shoulder to look into the woods. I genuinely felt like time had slowed down as I looked over. And you know, this situation speaks volumes to the skills that my parents bestowed on me with my first time in the woods. As the trees passed by, I could clearly make out two fully open eyes reflecting back at me. I could clearly make out two full reflective circles. I was completely frozen and couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if the eyes were locked on me or the whole vehicle, or even what light they were reflecting off of as we were driving beside the woods. They were clearly further back into the woods by a couple of meters, so I couldn't make out how tall it was, but I could very easily see they were attached to a head much larger and taller than a human. I completely forgot about comforting the passenger in front of me, and instead tried to turn and see it for longer through the back window as we kept driving, but had completely lost the visual. I couldn't even make a sound, but my mind was racing the longer I sat, the longer I wondered how the hell it got to where I could see it after we had sped away from the parking spot. I don't know how much it saw from the car, but I know it saw me, it saw all of us in those woods. I don't know how to describe it other than that I was fully prey, and whatever it was a predator that knows me now. After driving for a while on our way back to a friend's farm, we were all able to speak about what had happened. We all heard the same noises, heard the rustling, heard the same far too long screams, and finally the other passenger and I both agreed on seeing the same wide eyes staring at us. Neither of us got a good look at what it was, but both agreed that it was staring at us and was too big to make out. That passenger also made a comment that, even though it was a couple of meters into the woods when he saw it, it had to be much bigger than a human. After a couple of hours more conversing about it, we all finally felt comfortable driving back to our respective homes. Every couple of months when we'd see each other, we'd make sure to each other that we all saw the same thing, as we wanted to make sure none of us were truly losing it mentally. I set the events of this story for about a year, not really sure who to tell or who would believe any of us for that matter. Once I finally felt comfortable talking and researching things similar, I came to the personal conclusion that it might be something along the lines of a skinwalker, and started looking further into stories about it. As there was so much talk of people having similar encounters or strange happenings in Lob's Bush, I really wanted to entertain and research any and all possibilities. On top of that, although raised somewhat Christian in school, I was never a dogma I really followed or was heavy into the idea of other powers, until this happened. For me, if this was real and it happened to me, I couldn't disprove anything, and has vastly changed the way I look at any form of religion or spiritual beliefs. Through friends and a few events, I know a fair number of indigenous groups and older members that I felt believed enough of the old ways to tell this story. All three elders essentially said the same thing along the very blunt line of, "Yup, that sounds like a skinwalker," and a few shared similar encounters that other friends and family have had. Only within the last, I think, 2 years, I talked to a few more people about it, and one friend finally recommended that I Google what a skinwalker sounded like. I finally looked online and heard some very similar sounds that sent the same "it's watching" chills down my spine, and felt that on top of everything else was enough confirmation for me. To this day, now have started my own spiritual path with respect to the lands, and especially now being on Turtle Island, that I walk on. In addition to the classic "don't whistle" or "say its name at night," I've made it very clear to my close friends who have all heard this story and respectfully know me as the outdoorsy camping friend, that if I ever feel anything similar to being watched, or that we shouldn't be in these woods, to get the fuck out with me. So, this is my story of what I believe was my encounter with a skinwalker. I thought it would be good to share this on the sub. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll answer them the best I can. I've also attached backup links and an additional interview link to someone's project on Lob's Bush made about 10 years ago too. For context, that teacher was also named Lob. It's about as common as the last name Smith where I'm from.
That's the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down your views. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing, so you may not miss any video in future.